Sorry about that. Somehow when I tried to get the screensaver to come back on, I shut it off. So I'm going to read the last part I was just reading again on page 26. Okay? Wilson says at the paragraph, "Oh, sure." "Oh, sure," agreed Wilson hurriedly, and he went toward the little office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and his pale hair as it veiled everything in the vicinity except his wife, who moved close to Tom. "I want to see you," said Tom intently. "Get on the next train." "All right. I'll meet you by the newsstand on the lower level." She nodded and moved away from him just as George Wilson emerged with 2 chairs from his office door. We waited for her down the road out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a gray, scrawny Italian child was setting torpedoes, those are fireworks, in a row along the railroad track. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. Remember, that's the sign. "Awful. It does her good to get away." "Doesn't her husband object?" "Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." Harsh. So Tom Buchanan and his girl and I went up together to New York. Or not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibilities of those East Eggers who might be on the train. Page 27. She had changed her dress to a brown-figured muslin, again a type of fabric, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of Town Tattle and a moving picture magazine, and in the station drugstore some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. Upstairs, in the solemn, echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before she selected a new one, lavender-colored. Lavender is purple, with gray upholstery, and in this we slid out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately she turned sharply from the window and, leaning forward, tapped on the front glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said earnestly. "I want to get one for the apartment. They're nice to have, a dog." We backed up to a gray old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket, swung from his neck, cowered a dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed, meaning we don't know what kind of dogs they really are. Indeterminate, I don't know what kind of dogs they are. "What kind are they?" asked Mrs. Wilson eagerly as he came to the taxi window. "All kinds. What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs. I don't suppose you got that kind." Excuse my horrible, low-class New York accent. The man peered doubtfully into the basket, plunged in his hand, and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "No, it's not exactly a police dog," said the man with disappointment in his voice. "It's more of an Airedale." You can look up what kind of dog an Airedale is, okay? He passed his hand over the brown wash rag of a back. "Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching cold." "I think he's cute," said Mrs. Wilson enthusiastically. Top of page 28. "How much is it?" "That dog?" He looked at it admiringly. "That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale," undoubtedly there was an Airedale concerned in it somewhere, though its feet were startlingly white, changed hands and settled down into Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked delicately. That dog? That dog's a boy." "It's a bitch," said Tom decisively. "Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it." Sorry. Obviously, he's referring to a female dog, okay? We drove over to Fifth Avenue, so warm and soft, almost pastoral on the summer Sunday afternoon that I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the corner. Pastoral refers to shepherds almost, like countryside shepherds and sheep, and that's why he is saying the whole thing. It was so pretty and so it came from a painting that I wouldn't be surprised to find sheep walking around, okay? So now Nick is going to try and get out of this whole thing because he's like, I'm not so sure I want to do this, okay? So he says, in the middle of page 28. Hold on, I said. I have to leave you here. No, you don't, interposed Tom quickly. Interposed. Vocab word. Right? He gets in between them. Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment, won't you, Myrtle? By the way, Tom So, that's Myrtle. Myrtle Wilson. Come on, she urged. I'll telephone my sister Catherine. She's said to be very beautiful by people who ought to know. Well, I'd like to, but we went on, cutting back again over the park, they're referring to Central Park, toward the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, the cab stopped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. Remember, haughty means snobby. I'm going to have the McKees come up, she announced as we rose in the elevator. And of course, I got to call up my sister, too. FYI, they're headed up to what I will, from this point forward, refer to as the sex apartment, okay? Tom is wealthy enough that he has a whole separate apartment where he takes his mistress, Myrtle Wilson, to conduct their business, their affair, all right? So pay attention to how this apartment looks. Sorry, just checking the time. It says on page 29 of the first paragraph, the apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with a set of tapestried furniture entirely too large for it. You might want to make a note of that. So that to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. Versailles is another thing in France. The furniture is tapestried, okay? Tapestries were those almost like rug-looking things that would hang on the walls in castles. You wouldn't really cover furniture in it, okay? However, if you think that that's what rich people do, that's why you'd have your furniture like that, okay? So it says, the only picture was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently a hen, sitting on a blurred rock. Looked at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance, or face, of a stout old lady beamed down into the room. FYI, he's describing a really bad picture of Myrtle's mom that's hanging on the wall. Several old copies of Town Tattle lay on the table, together with a copy of Simon Called Peter and some of the small scandal magazines of Broadway. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large, hard dog biscuits, one of which decomposed apathetically in the saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. Now, I've been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, although until after 8 o'clock, the apartment was full of cheerful sun. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had disappeared. They, meaning Tom and Myrtle. So I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey distorted things because it didn't make any sense to me. Just as Tom and Myrtle, after the first drink, Mrs. Wilson and I called each other by our first names, reappeared. Company commenced or began to arrive at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30 with a solid, sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again at a more rockish angle. It's either rockish or rakish. At a more rakish angle, right? But the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. What he's saying is chick plucked all her eyebrows off. You know how some girls, do that? And then she tries to, pencil it in, but the old eyebrows are drawing back, so it looks like she has two eyebrows, okay? Trying to be sophisticated, but really looks like a moron. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking as innumerable pottery bracelets jingled up and down along her arms. She came in with such a proprietary haste, remember proprietary means ownership, and looked around so possessively at the furniture that I wondered if she lived here. But when I asked her, she laughed immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and told me she lived with a girlfriend at a hotel. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. Flat is another word for apartment. He had just shaved, for there was a white spot of lather on his cheekbone, and he was the most respectful in his greeting to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the, quote, artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She told me with pride that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they had been married. Remember when I told you about the word strident? Strident! I think of Mrs. McKee like that, okay? Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume sometime before and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon. Okay, this is the third dress Chick has put on, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. With the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into an impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment, and as she expanded, the room grew smaller around her until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. "My dear," she told her sister in a high, mincing shout, "most of these fellows will cheat you every time. All they think of is money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet, and when she gave me the bill, you'd have thought she had my appendicitis out." "What was the name of the woman?" asked Mrs. McKee. "Mrs. Eberhardt. She goes around looking at people's feet in their home." Now I'm going to stop right there. Two things. Appendicitis is when you get your appendix taken out. Okay? It's actually a disease. And Myrtle is using it to talk about her feet. So what does that tell you about Myrtle? Time out and we'll come right back.